Good evening, all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we venture into the chilling depths of Canadian darkness, where 10 true stories of terror, mystery, and unfathomable loss have haunted the nation for decades. From the forests that swallow the innocent to the neighbors who harbor unimaginable secrets. These are the accounts that shattered lives and left communities scarred with unanswered questions. Each story represents a real person, a real tragedy, and the persistent grip of unexplained horror that refuses to fade from memory. These are not tales of fiction or embellishment, but verified accounts of the darkness that exists within our borders, waiting in the shadows of everyday life. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Canadian deep woods and urban streets alike, where civilization ends and terror begins. The mountain highway cutting through the Pacific Northwest of British Columbia becomes a different creature when autumn arrives. The dense evergreens that line the winding roads transform into darker silhouettes against the gray sky, and the mist rolls down from the peaks in thick, suffocating waves that make you feel like the world has compressed into the next 50 feet in front of your windshield. It was October 1974 when this landscape became the backdrop to a mystery that would haunt investigators, forensic experts, and the families of missing women for decades to come. My name is Thomas Reeves, and I was a park ranger working the remote regions of British Columbia during that era. I had seen my share of hikers gone missing, search and rescue operations that lasted weeks, and the occasional tragedy that accompanied people underestimating the wilderness. But nothing prepared me for what we discovered that particular October morning, and nothing in my 30 years of service would ever feel quite the same afterward. The call came in around 7 in the morning. A logging crew working about 15 miles northeast of Princeton, British Columbia, had found something suspicious while clearing brush near an old abandoned logging road. The description was vague over the radio, but the tone in dispatch's voice told me this was different. Not another lost hiker. Not an accident. Something deliberate. The logging road itself was barely passable, more of a scar through the forest than an actual route. And by the time I arrived with 2 other rangers and a police officer named Detective Marcus Webb, the crew had already cordoned off the area with orange flagging tape. The smell hit us first, not immediately overpowering, but present. That particular decomposition scent that gets into your sinuses and stays there for hours after you leave. The body was partially buried beneath loose rocks and forest debris about 30 yards from the road, arranged in a way that suggested someone had deliberately attempted concealment rather than having simply abandoned remains. What made my skin crawl was the meticulous nature of the arrangement. The rocks weren't scattered chaotically. They were stacked deliberately, almost architecturally precise, covering the body in a pattern that would have taken considerable time and effort to construct. The victim was female. That much was immediately apparent, though her body had been exposed to the elements long enough that detailed identification would require forensic analysis back at the regional coroner's office. She was stripped of all clothing, which Detective Webb noted immediately, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the scene. No wallet, no jewelry, no identification of any kind. But what disturbed Webb more than anything was the arrangement of personal items discovered beside the body. A small collection of objects, each placed with the same calculated precision as the rock formation itself. A hairbrush, a lipstick tube, the shade a deep coral that would have been fashionable in the early 1970s. A compact mirror, its surface still intact. A single pearl earring. A leather wallet, empty of identification, but containing a faded photograph of a young woman with dark hair, smiling at the camera with the kind of genuine joy that suggested she had no idea this was the last photograph that would ever exist of her. Each item was positioned in a neat row, almost like an exhibit at a museum, and as I looked at that arrangement, I felt something cold move through my chest. This wasn't the work of someone who killed in passion or even carelessness. This was someone who killed with intention and collected fragments of identity like trophies. Detective Webb photographed everything methodically, his camera clicking rapidly as he moved around the perimeter of the site. He took particular care with the items, capturing them from multiple angles, each one documented with professional precision. The hairbrush showed dark hairs still woven through the bristles. The lipstick bore the distinctive wear pattern of frequent use, the edge worn down on one side from the angle it had been applied. The compact mirror contained remnants of powder, a shade that suggested foundation or blush, products popular in that era. But the wallet was the most haunting. Webb opened it carefully, wearing gloves, and found a receipt from a grocery store dated September 12th, 1974, just 3 weeks prior. No name on the receipt, just a list of items: milk, bread, butter, eggs. Ordinary items purchased by someone who had no idea she was in the final weeks of her life. Webb radioed for the coroner's team and a forensics unit. Then he pulled me aside, while the other rangers began establishing a broader perimeter around the site. In my 15 years with the RCMP, I have never seen anything arranged like this, Webb told me, his voice low and controlled, though I could see the tension in his jaw. This person wanted us to know something, wanted us to find these items, wanted us to understand that this death was deliberate, methodical, planned. Over the next week, as forensic teams worked to extract and preserve evidence, we learned that the victim was a young woman who had gone missing from her home in the suburbs of Vancouver approximately 4 weeks prior. She'd been 28 years old. Her name was Jennifer Ashford. Her mother had filed a missing person report, but initial investigations had gone nowhere. No signs of struggle in her apartment, no witnesses, no leads. Her employer at the accounting firm downtown reported she had simply not shown up for work one Monday morning and had not answered her phone or responded to any attempts at contact. When officers visited her apartment, they found it exactly as she had left it. Coffee cup rinsed and placed in the rack beside the sink. Bed made neatly. Personal items all in their designated places. It was as if she had simply evaporated. What made the discovery in the mountains so disturbing was that the personal items found beside her remains didn't all match her. The photograph in the wallet showed Jennifer Ashford that was confirmed through her family. But the other items, the hairbrush, the lipstick, the compact mirror, the pearl earring, those suggested something even more sinister. Forensic analysis of the hair in the brush revealed it had come from at least 3 different individuals. The lipstick shade didn't match anything in Jennifer Ashford's apartment. The pearl earring was discovered to be missing its mate, and extensive searches of her residence turned up no matching pair. Webb's theory, which he shared cautiously with me during one of our meetings at the site, was that the killer had assembled these items from multiple sources, creating an almost ritualistic display. Perhaps trophies from previous victims, perhaps items stolen from their homes to commemorate the act. The rock formation drew particular attention from the forensic team. A geologist called in to analyze it reported that the stones had been deliberately selected and stacked with considerable structural knowledge. They weren't random rocks picked up nearby. They had been gathered from different areas, some showing signs of having been transported considerable distances. The arrangement created an almost cairn-like formation, similar to the stone markers hikers use to mark trails, but deliberately obscene in its construction, as if the killer was creating some kind of monument to his crime. Photographs were taken, measurements documented. The entire formation was dismantled carefully, each stone cataloged and photographed before removal, but no fingerprints were recovered. The stones had been exposed to months of rain and wind, washing away any evidence of human contact. The investigation into Jennifer Ashford's death consumed resources for months. Detective Webb became obsessed, spending countless hours reviewing missing person reports from the previous 5 years, looking for patterns. He found 3 other young women who had gone missing from the Vancouver area between 1970 and 1974. All were between 22 and 32 years old. All were professional women living alone or with roommates. All had disappeared without any obvious signs of struggle or coercion. Their cases remained unsolved. When Webb brought their details to the regional director of the RCMP, he was told there was no concrete evidence linking the disappearances. Different jurisdictions. No matching evidence, no witnesses. Without something concrete, resources couldn't be diverted to pursuing what might be coincidence. But what Webb couldn't shake was the arrangement of items beside Jennifer Ashford's remains. It was a message. A deliberate communication from someone who wanted us to understand the calculated nature of his crimes. The personal items weren't left by accident. They were curated, presented, almost as if he was creating a narrative about who he was and what he had done. I spent months thinking about those objects, about the person who had carefully selected a young woman from her apartment, transported her to a remote mountain location, and then arranged her remains beneath a precisely constructed rock cairn. What motivation drove such deliberation? What satisfaction did the killer gain from creating such a meticulous scene? Decades passed. The case of Jennifer Ashford remained officially unsolved, though Webb's conviction that multiple murders had been connected never wavered. He retired in 1988, still believing he had been close to identifying the perpetrator, but lacked the evidence to proceed. The missing persons reports from the 1970s were archived, their files gathering dust in basement storage. Jennifer's mother passed away in 1995 without ever knowing what happened to her daughter on that September morning in 1974. The other missing women from that era faded from public memory, their photographs yellowing in old newspapers. Their cases eventually closed or reclassified as voluntary disappearances. Then, in 2012, genetic genealogy emerged as a revolutionary investigative tool. Cold case units across North America began testing DNA evidence from old cases, comparing results against genealogical databases. Jennifer Ashford's remains were exhumed for DNA testing, and in March 2013, a match was made. The DNA profile matched a man named Robert Kane, who had died in a California prison in 2003 while serving time for an unrelated felony. Kane had lived in British Columbia between 1970 and 1976, working as a carpenter and construction worker, moving frequently, using several different names. His criminal record included arrests for sexual assault, stalking, and breaking and entering. When investigators reviewed his file, they found that he had been questioned about Jennifer Ashford's disappearance in 1974, but released due to insufficient evidence. He had subsequently fled to California, where he committed crimes that finally landed him in prison. But here is what still troubles me, even now, decades after that October morning, when we discovered Jennifer's remains beneath the carefully constructed stone cairn. The items arranged beside her body were never fully explained. The hairbrush with hair from 3 different individuals was never matched to any known missing persons case. The pearl earring was never identified. No other victims were ever conclusively linked to Robert Kane, though the evidence suggests there may have been more. And the most haunting detail is this: Kane never confessed. He died in prison maintaining his innocence, never acknowledging that he had murdered Jennifer Ashford or anyone else. We solved the case in the sense that we identified the perpetrator, but we never understood his motivation, never recovered all of his victims, and never gained the confession that might have provided closure to the families of the other missing women from that era. The mountain highway still cuts through the Pacific Northwest, and every October, when the mist rolls down from the peaks and the evergreens darken against the gray sky, I think about Jennifer Ashford standing in her apartment, 28 years old, her entire future stretching ahead of her. I think about the moment when Robert Kane entered her space, when her routine was violently interrupted, when she realized that everything was about to end in that precise, calculated way. And I think about those carefully arranged stones on a remote logging road, and what it means that someone had the skill and patience to construct such an architecture of concealment. Because what chills me most is understanding that for every person whose remains we recover, there are likely others still hidden in the remote places of British Columbia, waiting to be discovered, their stories locked inside the methodical minds of killers who are now beyond justice, taking their secrets with them into whatever darkness waits beyond death. My name is Vivian Tuccaro, and I am the mother of Amber Alyssa Tuccaro. For 14 years, I have carried the weight of a single moment, a decision made on an August evening in 2010 that lasted only seconds but changed everything forever. That moment was not when my daughter went missing. It was when I allowed her to go into the city. It was when I decided to trust that the world was safer than it actually is, that a young Indigenous woman hitchhiking alone through Alberta in the summer of 2010 would arrive at her destination safely. It was a moment that taught me that maternal instinct, that internal whisper that something is not right, is a language we must learn to speak before it is too late. Amber was 20 years old that summer. She was a member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation, living in Fort McMurray, Alberta, with me and her 14-month-old son, Jacob. She was a young mother navigating the complexities of single parenthood, working occasionally, and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy and joy, despite the circumstances that had brought her into motherhood at such a young age. She had dreams. She wanted to travel, to see more of Canada beyond the confines of Fort McMurray. She wanted Jacob to grow up knowing that the world held possibilities, that their lives weren't limited by geography or circumstance. In August 2010, when a friend invited her to take a vacation to Edmonton, Amber saw it as an opportunity to experience something beyond her daily routine. The two of them flew from Fort McMurray to Edmonton on August 17th, checking into a hotel in nearby Nisku. Jacob stayed with me. I remember waving goodbye as they left the apartment, Amber's face bright with excitement. She was wearing a casual sundress that morning, her dark hair pulled back, and she had that particular energy about her that young people have when they are anticipating something new. I told her to be careful. I told her to stay close to her friend. I told her all the things mothers tell their daughters when they are about to step into a world that has a history of swallowing young Indigenous women whole. The next evening, August 18th, around 8 o'clock, Amber and her friend decided to go into Edmonton from their hotel in Nisku. They were looking for entertainment, for the energy of the city, for something to do. The plan was to spend a few hours in Edmonton and return to the hotel. Amber's friend offered to drive, but Amber decided to hitchhike instead. She had done it before. She was comfortable with it. She did not yet understand that comfort is not the same as safety, that familiarity with a practice does not diminish its risks. She stepped to the side of the highway and put her thumb out, and a man in an unidentified vehicle pulled over. She climbed into the passenger seat. She believed she was on her way to the city. She believed this ride would take her where she wanted to go. She believed, perhaps, in the basic human decency that we are all taught to believe in. She was wrong. It was during this ride that Amber made a phone call. She called her friend, likely to tell her where she was or to check in, to maintain that thread of connection that might have made her feel less alone in a stranger's vehicle. The RCMP later released a recording of this phone call, and every time I listen to it, I feel my heart break in exactly the same way it did the first time. In that recording, Amber can be heard speaking to the driver. Her voice is calm but alert. She says, "You'd better not be taking me anywhere I don't want to go." That sentence, just that one sentence, contains within it the moment when Amber realized something was wrong. The driver had assured her they were heading east toward Edmonton, on a back road that would take them to the city. But Amber, with the intuition that kept her alive a few minutes longer, understood that the assurances were lies. She understood that the direction they were traveling was not east. She understood that this man was taking her somewhere else entirely. The detective investigating the case, when I spoke with him years later, told me that the tone of Amber's voice in that recording indicated increasing fear, not panic, not yet, but fear. The awareness that she had made a catastrophic mistake in accepting this ride, that she was now in a situation from which there was no simple exit, no rolling down the window and jumping out at highway speed, no easy escape. Her friend, hearing that recording played back, told me that Amber sounded scared, but was trying to maintain composure, trying to reason with the driver, trying to assert some control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her ability to manage. That phone call was the last time anyone heard Amber Alyssa Tuckerow's voice. The driver, whose identity remains unknown to this day, drove south into rural Leduc County, away from Edmonton, away from city lights and witnesses, into the kind of landscape where screams disappear into emptiness and bodies can remain hidden for years. What happened between the moment of that phone call and the moment when Amber was no longer alive can only be imagined. The official coroner's report would eventually indicate that she had been murdered, that the location in which she was found showed signs of violence, that her death was not accidental or self-inflicted, but the specific details, the sequence of events, the final moments of her consciousness, those remain locked away in the memory of one person, the person who drove south instead of east, who had intentions from the moment he pulled over to pick her up. When Amber did not return to the hotel the next morning, her friend called me. I remembered the exact quality of fear in her voice. It was not yet certainty. It was the earliest stage of knowing that something is fundamentally wrong. I called the RCMP. I reported my daughter missing. I believed that making that call would set in motion a cascade of professional protocols, that officers would be dispatched, that investigations would begin immediately, that the system designed to protect citizens would swing into action to find my child. I did not understand that the system was not designed equally for everyone. I did not understand that an Indigenous woman missing from a hitchhiking situation would not receive the same urgency of response as other disappeared persons. What I encountered instead was indifference masquerading as procedure. The RCMP told me that Amber had likely decided to stay in Edmonton longer than planned. They suggested, and I remember this with absolute clarity, that she was probably out having fun, partying, and that she would call when she felt like returning. They implied that young women are often unreliable about communication, that disappearance is not necessarily disappearance if we do not yet want to believe it. Days passed. I called repeatedly. I was transferred from number to number. I was told to call different detachments. I was given the runaround in a way that would later be officially documented as a failure of the RCMP's duty to respond appropriately to a missing Indigenous woman. I eventually got Amber back on the missing persons list on September 23, 2010, 1 full month after she disappeared. 1 month during which every hour mattered, during which investigators should have been working, should have been following leads, should have been taking seriously the fact that a young Indigenous woman had vanished under suspicious circumstances. On August 28, 2012, almost exactly 2 years after Amber disappeared, the RCMP released the recording of her phone call to the public. They hoped that someone would recognize the driver's voice, that someone would come forward with information about who this man was. The recording was played on news outlets across Canada. Thousands of people heard Amber's voice, heard her fear, heard her final known words. "You'd better not be taking me anywhere I don't want to go." Surely, everyone thought, someone will recognize this voice. Surely this man will be identified. Surely justice will follow. 4 days later, On September 1st, 2012, horseback riders exploring a rural property near Leduc County discovered Amber's remains. She had been there for 2 years. 2 years of seasons changing, of weather erosion, of her physical form becoming part of the landscape that had consumed her. The coroner's examination confirmed what I already knew in my heart, what had been growing as certainty since that first moment of unexplained absence. My daughter was dead. She had been murdered. She had been disposed of in a field where she might have remained undiscovered indefinitely if 2 people on horseback had not taken a particular trail on a particular day. But here is what the official investigation also revealed. When I had removed Amber from the missing persons list during that first confused month, the RCMP destroyed her personal property. The suitcase containing her belongings, the items that had been recovered from her hotel room, evidence that might have been crucial in identifying the driver or understanding what happened during that ride, was destroyed. According to the Federal Review released in 2018, the RCMP failed to follow proper procedures for preserving evidence. Their investigation was labeled deficient and did not comply with procedures and guidelines. This was the official acknowledgement that my daughter's case had been mishandled from the beginning, that the police response had been inadequate, that systemic failures had undermined any possibility of justice. The driver's voice in that recording has never been matched to anyone. The RCMP has never arrested anyone. To this day, I do not know who killed my daughter. I do not know if he was from Alberta or passing through. I do not know if there are other victims or if Amber was an isolated crime of opportunity. I do not know if he is still alive or if he passed away years ago, taking the truth with him into whatever silence waits beyond death. What I know is that my daughter made a phone call at 8 p.m. on August 18th, 2010. I know that she sounded afraid but maintained composure. I know that she understood something was wrong but could not escape. I know that approximately 2 hours later, she was no longer alive. I know that for 1 month, the RCMP treated her disappearance as inconsequential. I know that evidence was destroyed. I know that the case remains unsolved. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls conducted a federal review of the RCMP's handling of Amber's case. The inquiry concluded that the investigation had failed in multiple ways, that Indigenous women are systematically deprioritized in missing persons investigations, that the bias against Indigenous communities is embedded in the institutions designed to protect us. The Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP apologized to our family in July 2019, stating that the investigation was not our best work. Our family rejected that apology. An apology does not return my daughter. An apology does not identify the man who murdered her. An apology does not prevent the next young Indigenous woman from accepting a ride from a stranger and disappearing into Alberta's rural landscape. What keeps me awake at night is not speculation about what happened to Amber. It is the understanding that her case is one of over 1,000 documented cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. It is knowing that across British Columbia, along Highway 16 known as the Highway of Tears, dozens of young Indigenous women have vanished under similar circumstances, and the institutional response has been similarly inadequate. It is understanding that the system that was supposed to protect my daughter, that I called in good faith believing it would help, that system failed her in ways that were documented, investigated, and acknowledged but never truly remedied. The recording of Amber's voice continues to haunt the consciousness of anyone who has heard it. A young woman, aware that danger is present, speaking into a phone, hoping that her words would be heard, that someone would know where she was, that someone would come for her. Those words, "You'd better not be taking me anywhere I don't want to go," echo across the years as the most articulate expression of a moment when awareness collides with helplessness. She knew, she understood the threat, and she had no power to stop what was coming. That is the true horror, not the not knowing, but the moment of knowing captured in a voice recording, and the system's failure to translate that knowledge into action that could have saved her. My name is Detective Sergeant Steve Smith, and for nearly 4 decades, I've carried the weight of 2 murders that seem destined to remain unsolved mysteries, cold case files that would eventually be transferred to archival storage, forgotten by everyone except the families who lived with the permanent absence. On August 6, 1983, Susan Tice, a 45-year-old mother of 4, was found dead in her Toronto home. On December 22, 1983, just 4 months later, a 22-year-old woman named Erin Gilmore was discovered dead in her apartment, approximately 15 kilometers away from where Susan had been murdered. 2 separate crimes, 2 separate investigations, 2 separate suspects. Except they were not separate at all. They were the work of one man, and for 20 years, we did not know that. For 20 years, we investigated them independently, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing potential suspects who had nothing to do with the crimes, writing reports that filled file boxes but revealed nothing about the truth. It took the revolution of genetic genealogy, a technology that did not exist when these murders occurred, to finally solve what 40 years of traditional detective work could not. Susan Tice lived in a townhouse on Wickham Avenue in central Toronto. She was a devoted mother, a member of her community, a woman with a life that extended beyond the tragedy that would eventually consume it. On the evening of August 5th, someone entered her home. We do not know if a lock was forced or if a window was breached, or if she simply opened the door to someone she believed she could trust. What we do know is that an intruder made his way upstairs to her bedroom. And in that room, in the darkness of night, Susan Tice's life changed from everything it had been to everything it would never be. She was sexually assaulted. She fought back with the ferocity of a mother protecting herself. And in that struggle, she was stabbed 13 times. Her hands bore defensive wounds. Her body bore the marks of violence. The brutality of it was incomprehensible. A woman's life stolen, destroyed, erased by the violence of a man whose face she may or may not have known. The investigation that followed was exhaustive by the standards of that era. Officers interviewed neighbors. They examined the crime scene with the forensic technology available in 1983. They looked for connections between Susan and known criminals, between her life and potential motives. Blood evidence was collected, though the testing capabilities of the time could not identify it as anything more than blood. Semen was recovered at the scene, providing biological evidence of the attacker, but no means to identify him in an era before DNA databases, before genetic genealogy, before the technology that would eventually crack this case even existed. Investigators had a killer, in a sense. They had his biological signature, but they had no face, no name, no way to match that signature to any known criminal. The case went cold. Susan Tice's murder became one file among hundreds, and though the file remained open, resources moved to active investigations where leads remained. Then 4 months later, in December 1983, Erin Gilmore became the second victim. She was 22 years old, beautiful, the daughter of a prominent Toronto businessman who was connected to the international commercial elite. Her father's business partner was Peter Monk, a Canadian magnate with international influence. Erin's life had been one of privilege and opportunity. She was living independently in a second-floor apartment in central Toronto, exploring her own path, her own identity. On the evening of December 22nd, someone gained entry to her apartment. Like Susan Tice, Erin was in her bedroom when the attack occurred. Unlike Susan, Erin did not engage in an extended struggle. She was restrained with a scarf tied around her wrists. She was stabbed twice in the chest. The violence was swift, calculated, and devastating. Her killer left behind biological evidence, blood, semen, the signature of his presence at the crime scene. Again, the investigation was thorough. Again, resources were deployed. Again, potential suspects were examined and eventually excluded. But this time, because Aaron Gilmore's father had connections to powerful people in Toronto. The investigation received elevated attention. Theories were proposed. Suspects were pursued. The investigation generated hundreds of hours of police work, but without a match to existing criminal databases. Without a name or a face, the investigation eventually reached its limit. Aaron Gilmore's murder, like Susan Tice's murder, became a cold case file. 2 separate investigations, 2 separate victims, 2 separate mysteries that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. In the year 2000, 17 years after these murders, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. The Toronto Police Service was developing its own DNA database, cross-referencing evidence from crime scenes with profiles of known offenders. During this process, an officer examined the biological evidence recovered from Aaron Gilmore's murder and compared it to evidence recovered from Susan Tice's murder. The results were shocking in their clarity. The DNA matched perfectly, completely, without any possibility of error. One man had murdered both women. One perpetrator was responsible for both crimes. The killer we had been hunting in isolation was actually a serial murderer, and we had been investigating him without understanding that the 2 crimes were connected. But this revelation created a new problem. Yes, we now knew that one man had committed both murders. No, we still did not know who he was. Our DNA database contained profiles of convicted offenders, but if the killer had not been convicted of a crime before August 1983, his DNA would not be in the system. If he had been careful, if he had killed before being arrested for anything, if he had avoided the criminal justice system until after he had murdered these 2 women, our DNA would not match anything we had on file. We had his biological signature. We had absolute certainty that one man was responsible for both crimes. But identifying that man, putting a name and a face to that biological profile, remained impossible with the tools available to us. For the next 19 years, the case remained essentially frozen. The DNA evidence sat in our laboratory. Investigators occasionally reviewed the files, hoping that some new lead might emerge, that some new suspect might be identified and tested against our evidence. But leads were few and far between. Aaron Gilmore's family continued to ask questions, to seek justice, to keep the case in public consciousness through periodic media appeals. Susan Tice's family, though less connected to media attention, carried the same desire for answers, the same hope that someday someone would identify and arrest the man responsible for their mother's murder. Then, in 2019, everything changed. The Toronto Police Service made the decision to send our DNA evidence to a private laboratory in Texas called Othram. This laboratory had pioneered a revolutionary approach to genetic genealogy that involved taking DNA evidence and comparing it against the databases maintained by commercial ancestry services like Family Tree DNA and Ancestry.com. These databases contained millions of genetic profiles from people who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for genealogical research, for health reasons, for curiosity about their heritage. By matching our unknown killer's DNA against these massive databases, we could theoretically identify his biological relatives, trace his family tree, and narrow down the pool of potential suspects. The initial results were profound. Our killer was Cree, an indigenous person with heritage, connecting him to specific communities in northern Ontario. The genetic genealogy narrowed the potential suspect pool to specific families with histories in that region. But we now faced a new complication, a phenomenon called endogamy. In the communities where these families had lived for generations, marriages had occurred between related individuals for centuries. The result was that entire communities in northern Ontario were genetically related to each other, making it difficult to distinguish between distant cousins and close siblings. Our DNA showed that the killer was one of 5 brothers from the Sutherland family. We knew his biological family. We did not know which family member was the murderer. Over the next 2 years, from 2021 to 2023, Toronto police conducted an investigation that combined old-fashioned detective work with modern surveillance technology. Investigators traveled to Moosonee, a remote community of approximately 1,500 people in northern Ontario, located just south of James Bay. They conducted interviews with community members and provincial records clerks. They confirmed that some or all of the Sutherland brothers had lived in Toronto during the early 1980s, when both murders occurred. They began surveillance operations following the brothers, documenting their movements, collecting physical samples from discarded items. An undercover officer recovered a COVID-19 mask from one brother's trash. Another officer collected a pop can from a dumpster. These items, apparently insignificant in themselves, contained DNA that could be matched against our known killer's profile. Methodically, with warrant after warrant, the police department worked through the Sutherland brothers. 2 of them were dead, their DNA already on file in provincial records. 2 of them were still alive, and investigators managed to obtain DNA samples that definitively ruled them out as the killer. That left one brother, Joseph George Sutherland, 61 years old, living in Moosonee. When police obtained a warrant and approached him, when they showed him the evidence that his DNA matched perfectly with the biological evidence recovered from the 2 1983 crime scenes, when they confronted him with the genetic genealogy that had finally identified him 4 decades after his crimes, Joseph George Sutherland confessed. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. He accepted responsibility for the sexual assaults. He acknowledged the crimes that he had committed in 1983. What haunts me most is not the capture of the killer or the closing of the investigation. It is the understanding that without genetic genealogy, Joseph George Sutherland would have died without ever being held accountable for what he had done. Susan Tice would remain a cold case file. Aaron Gilmore would remain a cold case file. The families would carry their questions and their grief into the generations, never knowing who had taken their loved ones, never experiencing the closure of justice. It is the understanding that the technology which finally solved this case did not exist for 40 years. And if it had not been developed when it was, we would have reached a point where the investigation would have been officially closed, the file archived, the case declared permanently unsolved. The investigation of the Sutherland case revealed something else that troubles me deeply. It demonstrated that genetic genealogy, while revolutionary in its capacity to solve cold cases, also raises profound questions about privacy, about surveillance, about the right of individuals to have their genetic information remain private unless they have voluntarily chosen to share it with the criminal justice system. The databases used to identify Joseph George Sutherland contained genetic profiles of millions of people who had not committed crimes, who had submitted their DNA for reasons entirely unrelated to law enforcement. Their genetic information became, in effect, a tool to surveil an entire species, to create a system in which no one's DNA could remain truly private or secret. But for the families of Susan Tice and Aaron Gilmore, for the community members who had lived with the knowledge that a brutal killer was potentially still among them, the solution provided by genetic genealogy felt like justice. It felt like answers. It felt like the closing of a wound that had festered for 4 decades. Joseph George Sutherland is now imprisoned, serving a life sentence with no eligibility for parole for 21 years. He will spend the remainder of his life incarcerated, paying some measure of debt for the lives he took, the violence he inflicted, the families he destroyed. It is not perfect justice. It never could be. But it is justice nonetheless, delayed by 40 years, delivered by a technology that did not exist when the crimes were committed, and made possible by the persistent belief that every cold case, given time and the right tools, might eventually yield its secrets to investigators who refuse to give up hope that answers are still possible. My name is Patricia Davison, and I have spent the last 53 years carrying a portrait in my mind of a 6-year-old girl with dark curls and a smile that could light up an entire room. Her name was Ljubica Topic. We called her Ljube. She was my niece, my sister's daughter. And on May 13th, 1971, she disappeared from our neighborhood in Windsor, Ontario, on a day that began like any other spring day, but ended with the certainty that evil exists in forms we cannot always anticipate or protect ourselves against. For 19 years, we did not know what happened to her. We lived with the absence, with the not knowing, with the terrible and continuous speculation about what she had suffered. Then, in 1990, her remains were discovered in a shallow grave, and we learned that she had been murdered. But even with that horrible knowledge, we did not know who had killed her. It took another 31 years until 2021 for genetic genealogy to finally reveal the identity of the man who destroyed our family. This is the story of how a 6-year-old girl's case remained cold for half a century, how institutional systems failed us repeatedly, and how technology finally brought us something approaching closure. Ljube was the youngest of 4 children in a close-knit family. Our neighborhood in Windsor was the kind of place where children played outside unsupervised, where parents believed their children were safe in the streets and parks and playgrounds. It was a community of working-class families, immigrant families, people who had come to Canada seeking opportunity and building lives that, we believed, were secure and predictable. On May 13th, 1971, Ljube asked permission to go play with her friend Jennifer outside. It was a warm day. Spring was turning to summer. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of children at play. My sister gave permission, as parents did in that era, believing that the neighborhood was safe, that other adults would look out for children, that the world was a place in which a 6-year-old girl could safely go outside and play. Ljube put on her shoes. She walked out the door. She was never seen alive again. The search that followed was immediate and desperate. My sister called neighbors. She contacted the police. Within hours, an official missing person investigation was underway. Police officers searched the neighborhood, interviewing anyone who might have seen Ljube, looking for any sign of where she might have gone. Days passed with no result. Weeks passed. The media became involved, covering the disappearance of the young girl, generating public awareness, appealing for information from anyone who might know what had happened. But despite all of these efforts, despite the search dogs and the volunteers and the police resources deployed, Ljube could not be found. The investigation gradually wound down as resources were redirected to other cases, as hope faded, as the active search transformed into a cold case file. My sister lived the rest of her life knowing that her daughter had disappeared, that her remains were somewhere in the landscape, undiscovered and unmarked. 19 years later, in 1990, construction workers near the outskirts of Windsor discovered human remains in a shallow grave. The remains were fragmented and severely decomposed, but dental records eventually confirmed the identity. Ljubica Topic, missing since 1971. She had been murdered. The manner of death suggested she had suffered violence, that her death had not been accidental, but identifying who had committed the crime remained a mystery. The remains were tested with the DNA technology available in 1990, but the biological evidence was degraded, made unreliable by 19 years of exposure to the elements. The case remained open but inactive. Investigators suspected certain individuals but lacked evidence to make an arrest. My sister, who had spent 19 years hoping that Ljube might somehow return, now had to accept that her daughter was dead, murdered, and that her killer remained unknown. For the next 31 years, from 1990 to 2021, that was the status of Ljube's case, an unsolved murder, a known victim, an unknown perpetrator. My sister passed away in 2005, carrying to her grave the knowledge that her daughter's killer remained free. The rest of the family continued to live with that injustice, with that absence, with the understanding that someone in our community had murdered a child and had never faced justice for that crime. We did not know if the killer was still alive, if he had died, if he had moved away or was still living in Windsor. We knew nothing except that Luba was gone and that the system had failed to find her killer. Then, in 2021, 50 years after Luba disappeared, genetic genealogy became available as an investigative tool. The Windsor Police Service decided to submit the biological evidence recovered from Luba's remains to a private laboratory specializing in investigative genetic genealogy. The DNA was degraded by half a century of exposure, but modern technology could extract enough information to create a usable profile. That profile was uploaded to genetic genealogy databases, and the system began the process of comparing Luba's killer's DNA against millions of profiles in commercial ancestry databases. The results, when they came back, identified a suspect, Frank Arthur Hall. He had been a neighbor in the area in 1971, living on the same road as Luba's family. Police had investigated him in 1971, had questioned him about Luba's disappearance, but had lacked evidence to charge him. Over the following decades, Frank Arthur Hall had lived his life. He worked. He had family relationships. He moved away from Windsor to Edmonton, Alberta, building a life that existed outside the shadow of the 1971 murder. Then, in 2019, Frank Arthur Hall died. He died before ever being arrested, before ever being charged, before ever being brought to justice for the murder of Luba Topic. But genetic genealogy had identified him. His name was released to the public in February 2022, 51 years after he had murdered the 6-year-old girl, and 51 years after that girl had disappeared into the uncertainty of an unsolved case. His name was Frank Arthur Hall, and he was dead. There would be no trial. There would be no conviction. There would be no incarceration. There would be no formal justice system response to his crime. He had lived an entire lifetime, while Luba never lived beyond 6 years old. What troubles me most profoundly is understanding that for 40 years, from 1971 to 2011, it was entirely possible that we would never know who murdered Luba Topic. There was no genetic genealogy in 1971. There was no DNA database. There was no technology to match unknown DNA against millions of potential relatives. If Frank Arthur Hall had died before genetic genealogy was developed, if the technology had not been created, if the genetic genealogy companies had not built their massive databases of millions of family trees, we would have carried this mystery to our own graves. Luba Topic's murderer would have remained unknown, unnamed, unpunished, except by the silent judgment of time and decay. The investigation also raised disturbing questions about institutional failures. Police had identified Frank Arthur Hall as a suspect in 1971. They had questioned him. They had allowed him to remain free. Perhaps they lacked evidence at the time. Perhaps they questioned him and found him unconvincing as a suspect. But the fact remains that the person ultimately identified as the killer was within the scope of police investigation immediately after the crime occurred, and the system failed to charge him, failed to investigate him thoroughly enough, failed to pursue the case with the rigor and persistence that a murdered child deserved. My sister never knew that genetic genealogy would eventually identify her daughter's killer. She lived and died in the era before that technology existed, carrying the pain of not knowing, hoping against hope that someday answers would come. When those answers finally arrived, they came too late for her to experience any relief or satisfaction. They came in a world in which the killer was already dead, beyond prosecution, beyond the reach of human justice. The Windsor Police Service held a press conference in February 2022 to announce that Luba Topic's murder had been solved. They released Frank Arthur Hall's name. They explained how genetic genealogy had led to his identification. They presented this as a success, as a case closed, as justice finally served. But standing in that room, hearing that name spoken aloud, understanding that the man who had murdered my 6-year-old niece had lived a full lifetime after his crime, had died before ever being arrested, I could not find comfort in what the police department called closure. I could only find the terrible knowledge that Luba had never had a chance to live, and that the man responsible for ending her life had been granted that opportunity by the failures of 1971's investigative procedures. Luba Katopik is buried now. Her remains are in the ground, finally laid to rest with knowledge of who murdered her. But the injustice is not laid to rest. The injustice is that she never grew beyond 6 years old. The injustice is that for 50 years, her killer walked free. The injustice is that genetic genealogy had to exist, had to be developed, had to be refined, and deployed before her murder could be solved. The injustice is that an entire generation of people died without ever knowing the answer to the question that defined our family. Who killed Luba Katopik? We know now. His name was Frank Arthur Hall. He lived in the neighborhood. He was questioned by police. He was not arrested. He lived his entire life while Lubisa's life was stolen from her at 6 years old. And the only satisfaction we can take from his identification is the knowledge that his name is now permanently connected to his crime, that his secret is finally exposed, that the family and the community no longer have to carry the burden of not knowing. But that satisfaction is hollow, because the man is dead, because justice cannot be served on him, because he never had to face trial or incarceration or any formal accounting for what he did. Genetic genealogy solved the mystery of who killed Luba Katopik, but it could not bring her back. It could not give her the life that was stolen. It could only confirm what we already knew in our hearts, that an innocent child had been murdered, and that the man responsible had lived far too long as a free man. My name is Dr. Richard Hartwell, and I have spent the last 40 years researching and documenting one of the most inexplicable disappearances in Canadian history. On a landscape so remote that the nearest settlement is over 500 kilometers away, 30 indigenous people simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind only abandoned structures and the silence of the Arctic tundra. This is the story of what happened at Anjunj, a small settlement in Manitoba's far north, sometimes referred to by locals as the Ghost Settlement, the place where an entire community walked into the wilderness and never returned. The year was approximately 1907, though the exact date remains uncertain because of the remoteness of the location and the fact that no official records were kept in the early 20th century. What happened there defies rational explanation, and over a century later, we still do not know what became of those 30 people, what forced them to abandon their settlement, or whether they are dead, or whether some impossible truth exists beyond what our civilization has yet discovered. The settlement at Anjunj was established by a small group of indigenous people, the Inuit, though the historical records often refer to them by terms that are now considered outdated and inappropriate. They had chosen this location because it provided access to hunting grounds and fishing areas that sustained their community throughout the year. The settlement consisted of approximately 30 permanent residents, men, women, and children, who had built homes adapted to the harsh Arctic environment, who had developed a system of survival that had worked for generations. They had established patterns of life that extended through seasons of extreme weather, through periods of isolation, through the kind of hardship that required not just survival skills, but a profound spiritual connection to the land. By all accounts, from the few travelers who had visited Anjunj in the years before 1907, the community appeared stable, functioning, and sustainable. The first indication that something had changed came in the spring of 1908, when a trader traveling the remote northern routes of Manitoba approached the settlement, expecting to conduct seasonal trading. Instead of encountering the community he had visited before, he found only abandoned structures. The homes were intact. The tools were present. Evidence suggested that the departure had occurred relatively recently, within months, the trader estimated, though precise dating was impossible given the lack of documentation and the remoteness of the location. But the people were gone, all 30 of them. The trader reported the discovery to the nearest RCMP outpost, approximately 200 kilometers away, and set off a search that would ultimately provide more questions than answers. By the time the RCMP reached Anjunj, weeks had passed. The abandoned settlement had deteriorated. Further, the RCMP officers found no indication of violence, no bodies, no obvious signs of struggle. The buildings were still standing. Some contained personal possessions. Food stores were present in certain structures, suggesting that the departure had not been a panicked evacuation, but something more deliberate, more planned, more organized. The officers conducted what investigations were possible given the limited technology of the early 20th century and the vast distances involved. They found no graves. They found no evidence of a massacre. They found no indication of what had motivated an entire community to abandon their settlement and effectively disappear. Over the following months and years, search parties were organized to explore the surrounding regions. Indigenous guides familiar with the territory were consulted. Hunters and trappers who knew the Arctic landscape were questioned. But no trace of the 30 missing people was ever discovered. No bodies were found. No remains were identified. No one in the surrounding communities reported encountering the missing Inuit people or their families. The prevailing theory among investigators was that the community had deliberately abandoned the settlement to relocate to another region, perhaps moving south, perhaps merging with other communities, perhaps simply choosing to leave the settlement for reasons that remained unknown. But this theory created an enormous problem. No one could find any evidence that this relocation had occurred. No community to the south reported the arrival of approximately 30 new members. No traders or trappers reported encounters with the missing people. The missing settlement's residents seemed to have vanished, not just from Anjunj, but from all available historical record, from all witness accounts, from all evidence of their subsequent existence. It was as if the entire community had ceased to exist at a specific moment in 1907 or 1908. What emerged from the mystery was a void that filled with speculation, myth, and theory. Some researchers proposed that the entire community had perished from disease, that a plague or epidemic had swept through and killed everyone, and that the bodies had been disposed of according to burial practices that left no archaeological evidence. Others suggested that they had deliberately ended their lives in a mass suicide event, perhaps in response to starvation, perhaps in response to external circumstances that had motivated collective decision-making. Still others proposed theories involving supernatural or paranormal events, that the settlement had been the site of some kind of mysterious event that had caused people to flee in such haste that they never contacted civilization again. The most unsettling theories were those that proposed deliberate foul play. Some researchers suggested that the settlement had been attacked by an outside force, that the residents had been killed, and that their remains had been hidden or disposed of in locations that were never subsequently discovered. Others proposed that government agents or colonial authorities had deliberately removed the population for reasons that were never officially acknowledged. These theories remain speculative and lack concrete evidence, but they reflect the disturbing reality that an entire community of indigenous people had simply ceased to exist, and no official investigation had ever conclusively determined why or how that disappearance had occurred. In 1921, 13 years after the initial abandonment, an RCMP officer named Inspector Meade traveled to Untold with the intention of conducting a more thorough investigation. He reported that the settlement remained largely as it had been in 1908. The structures were deteriorating. The personal possessions had been scattered or destroyed by weather and wildlife. But Meade noted something that previous investigators had not: evidence of deliberate organization in the settlement's abandonment. Possessions had been arranged in certain ways. Doors had been closed and secured. Tools had been organized and stored. This suggested to Meade that the departure had not been a sudden evacuation, but a planned, organized relocation in which residents had taken time to secure their settlement, suggesting that they intended either to return or to ensure that the location remained usable if someone were to visit in the future. Meade's investigation produced a report suggesting that the community had deliberately relocated and that contemporary authorities should have made greater efforts to locate them. But by 1921, 13 years of silence suggested that if relocation had occurred, it had happened to a location so remote or so isolated that the community had never made contact with any settlement or trading post where their presence would have been documented. Alternatively, the community had relocated to a location where they were deliberately avoiding contact with colonial authorities, suggesting that their departure may have been motivated by concerns about government intervention or colonial pressure. The truth is that we do not know what happened to the 30 residents of Untold. We have no bodies. We have no remains. We have no DNA evidence because no biological material has ever been recovered. We have no records documenting their subsequent lives. We have only the mystery of an abandoned settlement and the complete disappearance of an entire community from all historical documentation. In 1962, 54 years after the abandonment of Untold, the Canadian government officially classified the case as unsolved, and the file was archived. No further investigation has been conducted since that time. What troubles me most profoundly is understanding that this was not an isolated incident. Throughout the early 20th century, numerous indigenous communities experienced periods of contact with colonial authorities, periods of pressure related to resource extraction and land appropriation, and subsequent periods in which their populations declined or simply disappeared from documentation. The case of Untold may represent a deliberate relocation undertaken to escape colonial pressure. It may represent a community that chose to abandon contact with the colonial government. It may represent something far darker: a removal, a massacre, an official action that was never formally acknowledged or investigated. We will likely never know the truth. No one alive today has first-hand knowledge of what happened at Untold in 1907 or 1908. Any members of the community who survived are now long dead. Any colonial authorities involved in the incident are beyond the reach of justice. Any official records that might have documented the event have either been destroyed or remain classified and inaccessible to contemporary researchers. What remains is the settling silence of the Arctic tundra, the abandoned structures that have decayed and weathered over more than a century, and the memory of a community that existed and then ceased to exist, leaving behind only questions. In recent years, advances in archaeology and DNA analysis have made it possible to investigate ancient sites in ways that were impossible in the early 20th century. Some researchers have proposed mounting expeditions to Untold to conduct excavations to search for remains that might answer the questions that have persisted for over a century. But these expeditions have faced practical obstacles: the extreme remoteness of the location, the harsh Arctic climate, the cost of mounting an investigation in such an environment, and perhaps most significantly, the ethical questions about whether disturbing the remains of indigenous people serves a legitimate investigative purpose or merely perpetuates the colonial pattern of treating indigenous communities as subjects of investigation rather than as human beings with dignity and autonomy. What I know is that 30 people disappeared. What I know is that their settlement was abandoned. What I know is that no satisfactory explanation has ever been provided. What I do not know is what became of them, whether they lived or died, whether their disappearance was voluntary or forced, whether it was a tragedy or a deliberate escape from circumstances that felt intolerable. The ghost settlement of Anjunj remains a mystery, and perhaps the most respectful response to that mystery is to acknowledge that we may never know what happened, to honor the memory of a community that simply ceased to exist in the historical record, and to recognize that the disappearance of an entire community raises questions about what other stories have been lost, what other histories have been erased, and what truths about our past remain hidden beneath layers of silence and time. My name is Detective James Morrison, and for 43 years, I have carried the responsibility of a case that haunted my career, a violent crime committed in the darkness of an Edmonton summer night, a perpetrator who walked free for decades because the technology to identify him did not yet exist. On June 23, 1981, a 17-year-old girl I will call Poppy was viciously attacked in a parking lot near a shopping center in Edmonton, Alberta. She was sexually assaulted, stabbed repeatedly, and left for dead by someone whose face she may or may not have seen in the darkness, but whose DNA was imprinted on her body and recorded in evidence that would sit in a police storage facility for 41 years, waiting for the technology that would finally identify her attacker. This is the story of how a teenage girl's life was shattered in a moment of brutality, how the justice system failed to protect her, and how genetic genealogy finally delivered what decades of traditional investigation could not: the identity and conviction of the man who had stolen her childhood and left her with trauma that would shape the remainder of her existence. It was summer in Edmonton, the season when the northern latitude means that darkness does not arrive until nearly 11 o'clock at night, when teenagers are out late because the weather is warm and the nights are short. Poppy had gone to a shopping center with friends, a normal summer evening, an ordinary teenage experience in a city that felt safe enough for a young woman to move through its spaces without excessive fear. She was 17 years old, still in high school, with her entire life stretching ahead of her, with possibilities that seemed unlimited, with a future that appeared bright and full of potential. She had no idea that on this particular evening, in this particular shopping center parking lot, her future would be violently interrupted, that the trauma she was about to experience would redefine the trajectory of her life. When she left her friend's company and walked toward the parking lot, she was alone. It was a decision that seemed innocent at the time, a brief separation that should have been inconsequential. But in that moment of solitude, someone was watching. Someone was waiting. Someone was planning to take what Poppy had not offered, to inflict violence on a person who had done nothing to deserve it, to commit a crime that would alter not just her life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. The attacker emerged from the shadows and confronted her. The details of what happened in the immediate moments after are preserved in police reports, in medical records, in the testimony that Poppy gave to investigators in the days following the assault. She was physically overpowered. She was sexually assaulted. She was stabbed multiple times, wounds that were severe enough to require emergency medical intervention, injuries that left permanent physical scars, and temporary medical hospitalization. The attack was brutal and calculated. It was not a crime of passion or a momentary loss of control. It was the work of someone who had committed violence before, someone who had learned techniques, someone who had developed the ability to inflict harm with a kind of practiced precision. The attacker escaped into the night, leaving behind a severely injured teenager who would be discovered by shoppers minutes after he fled. Emergency services responded. Poppy was transported to the hospital. Medical personnel documented her injuries. Police were called. Detectives began an investigation that would ultimately span 41 years. The forensic evidence collected in the immediate aftermath of the attack was comprehensive. Blood samples were taken, semen was collected, fingernail scrapings were preserved, hair samples were recovered. In 1981, this biological evidence had limited evidentiary value. DNA technology did not exist. The evidence could be typed into blood groups, but that information was not distinctive enough to identify a specific perpetrator from the general population. What could be done was to exclude suspects who did not match the biological evidence profiles. But to identify the actual perpetrator, investigators needed either a confession or some other lead that would point them toward a specific suspect. The police investigation was thorough. Investigators interviewed Poppy extensively, gathering details about the attacker that she had observed. They canvassed the shopping center. They spoke to employees and customers who had been present that evening. They reviewed security footage, though the surveillance technology of 1981 was primitive by modern standards, capturing grainy images with limited clarity and no ability to zoom or enhance. They followed leads. They investigated suspects. But despite all of these efforts, the investigation eventually stalled. The attacker remained unidentified. Without a specific suspect to test against the biological evidence, investigators had no means of making a match. The case was eventually classified as inactive, and Poppy's attacker remained free. What troubles me most profoundly is understanding that in the years immediately following the attack, there may have been opportunities to identify the attacker if the investigation had followed different procedures, or if witnesses had come forward with information. The perpetrator was likely someone from the Edmonton area, someone who had committed violence before, someone whose DNA profile might have been generated if he had been arrested for any crime in the decades that followed 1981. But without that triggering event, without that initial connection to the criminal justice system, there was no mechanism to identify him. He lived his life for the next 41 years, while Poppy lived her life carrying the trauma of what he had done to her. He worked. He had relationships. He may have had a family. He may have assaulted other people. He may have committed crimes that were never reported or investigated. And he remained unknown to the authorities who should have been hunting him. In the late 1990s, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. The Edmonton Police Service began building a DNA database, entering profiles from convicted offenders and from sexual assault cases where evidence had been preserved. Poppy's case was entered into this database, but still without a suspect to test against the evidence, there was no match to be made. The biological profile of her attacker sat in the database, waiting for a connection that might never come. Detectives who worked on the case occasionally reviewed the file, hoping that some new development might emerge, but the investigation remained essentially frozen, unable to advance without new information or new technology. The breakthrough came in 2019. 38 years after the attack, genetic genealogy had become available as an investigative tool. The Edmonton Police Service made the decision to submit Poppy's case evidence to a private laboratory specializing in investigative genetic genealogy. The biological samples, preserved for nearly 4 decades, still contained enough DNA to create a usable genetic profile. That profile was uploaded to genetic genealogy databases, and the system began comparing it against millions of family trees maintained by commercial ancestry services. The results identified a match. The match pointed to a family in the Edmonton area. Investigators used traditional detective work to narrow down which family members were the right age and location to have committed the assault in 1981. They eventually identified a suspect, a man now in his 60s, who had been 17 or 18 years old in 1981. Police conducted surveillance. They obtained a warrant to collect biological samples from the man's trash. The DNA collected from discarded items was tested and compared against the evidence from Poppy's assault. It was a perfect match. After 41 years, the identity of the perpetrator had been established. When police arrested the suspect, they discovered something else. This man had been arrested for a sexual assault in the years after 1981. He had been convicted, served time, and was now on the sexual offenders registry. But because DNA databases and sexual offender registries did not exist in the early 1980s, his earlier assault on Poppy had never been connected to him. If such systems had existed at the time of his first conviction, he would have been identified as Poppy's attacker, and her case would have been solved within years rather than decades. He could have been incarcerated, preventing him from potentially assaulting other women in the intervening period. The man pleaded guilty to the assault on Poppy. He accepted responsibility for the crime he had committed 41 years earlier. He was sentenced to additional prison time, though, given his age and the fact that he had already served time for a subsequent assault, the sentence represented a relatively small additional punishment for a crime that had devastated one woman and potentially prevented him from assaulting others if he had been properly prosecuted and incarcerated in the years immediately following 1981. What I struggle to reconcile is the understanding that Poppy's attacker was in the system, was documented in law enforcement records, and could have been connected to her assault if the investigative mechanisms of that era had been more effective, or if DNA technology had been available decades earlier. The man had committed a sexual assault, had been caught, had been convicted, and had been imprisoned. But his crimes were not connected to each other. They were treated as separate incidents, separate investigations, separate offenses by different victims in different time periods. The system failed to recognize that the same person was responsible for multiple violations, that he was a serial sexual offender, that earlier intervention might have prevented subsequent assaults. When Poppy learned in 2022 that her attacker had finally been identified and convicted, when she learned that the technology had finally caught up to the evidence that had been preserved in 1981, she experienced something that resembles closure, but that is not complete. The attacker had already served time for a different assault. He was already known to law enforcement as a sexual offender. But for 41 years, she had carried the trauma of his attack without knowing his name, without the confirmation that he had been caught, without the sense of justice that comes from a conviction. The delay meant that she had to carry that burden alone, in silence, for over 4 decades. The case of the Edmonton assault reveals something profound about how criminal justice systems function and how they fail. It reveals that even when evidence is preserved, even when a crime is documented, even when a perpetrator commits subsequent crimes that bring him into contact with the legal system, the mechanisms of justice can fail to connect the pieces, to recognize the pattern, to hold offenders accountable for the totality of their crimes. It reveals that investigative technology matters profoundly, that the difference between a solved case and an unsolved case can be nothing more than whether the right investigative tools exist at the right moment in history. What gives me hope is that genetic genealogy has changed the equation. Cases that would have remained unsolved in the era before this technology now have the possibility of resolution. Perpetrators who might have lived their entire lives without facing justice can now be identified decades after their crimes. Survivors like Poppy can finally receive confirmation that their attacker has been caught, that they were not blamed, that their assault was taken seriously by the system, even if resolution took 41 years to arrive. But what also troubles me is understanding that for every case that is solved by genetic genealogy, there are likely other cases, other perpetrators, other survivors who are still waiting. The technology is revolutionary, but it is also resource intensive. Not every police department has the funding to submit evidence to genetic genealogy laboratories. Not every case receives the attention necessary to pursue this investigative path. And there are cases where evidence has been destroyed, where biological samples have degraded beyond recovery, where the chain of custody has been compromised. For those cases, for those survivors, for those families who are still searching for answers, the revolution of genetic genealogy came too late. Poppy's case was solved 41 years after the crime was committed. She is now in her 60s, living with the permanent effects of trauma that was inflicted on her when she was 17 years old. She has never been able to completely heal because the wound of not knowing who had hurt her remained open for over 4 decades. Now, finally, with the name and conviction of her attacker, she can begin a different kind of healing process, one that acknowledges that her assault was taken seriously, that justice was eventually served, and that the system, however imperfectly and however late, did ultimately work to hold her attacker accountable for what he had done. My name is Margaret Hayes, and I am the sister of Sharon Pryor, a teenager who was murdered in Toronto in 1975, nearly 50 years ago. For 48 years, I did not know who killed my sister. I carried her memory through decades of my own life, through the raising of my children, through the building of a career and relationships and routines that were all shaped by the permanent absence of a person who should have been present throughout all of those years. Sharon was 14 years old when she disappeared on March 12, 1975, from a street in Toronto. Her body was discovered within days, and the official cause of death was determined to be homicide. But the identity of her killer remained a mystery, an open case that occasionally received media attention, but gradually faded from public consciousness as new crimes emerged, as other victims demanded attention, as the decades passed, and the investigation reached the cold case archives. Then, in 2024, nearly 50 years after Sharon's murder, genetic genealogy finally revealed the name of the man who killed my sister. His name was Norman Seeley, and he had died in 2011, 13 years before his crime was finally traced to him through the revolutionary technology that did not exist when he committed his murder. Sharon was 14 years old. I was 8. I remember her as a bright, kind presence in our household, a teenager who paid attention to her younger sister, who took time to help me with my homework, who seemed to be navigating the particular complexities of adolescence with grace and maturity. She was interested in school. She was interested in the world. She had friends and interests and a future that seemed full of possibility. On March 12, 1975, she left our home to go to a local mall with friends. It was a typical adolescent outing, a Wednesday afternoon, nothing that would have seemed in any way dangerous or unusual. She was wearing a blue jacket. She was carrying a small purse. She was looking forward to spending time with her friends and engaging in the kind of ordinary teenage activities that consumed her world. What happened next remains one of the most brutal reminders of how quickly an ordinary day can transform into tragedy. Sharon went to the mall. She spent time with her friends. At some point, she separated from them or encountered someone while she was alone. The details of exactly what happened and how her separation from her friends occurred were never fully documented in the police investigation. What we know is that by the following day, March 13th, 1975, Sharon Pryor had been murdered. Her body was discovered in a wooded area near Toronto, and the cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. She had been beaten to death by someone. The brutality of her murder suggested rage, violence, the kind of violence that seemed almost incomprehensible to me as an 8-year-old child, though the full weight of what had happened to my sister was not fully comprehensible to me until I was much older and could understand the implications of her death. The investigation that followed was thorough for an investigation in 1975. Police canvassed the area. They interviewed potential witnesses. They gathered forensic evidence from the crime scene and from Sharon's body. But the investigative tools available in 1995 were primitive by modern standards. DNA technology did not exist. Fingerprinting was limited in its application. The biological evidence collected at the crime scene could not be used to identify a specific perpetrator unless that person had been arrested and processed through the criminal justice system, creating a record for comparison. The investigation eventually stalled. Leads were exhausted. Potential suspects were interviewed and eventually cleared or simply lost to the investigation because they could not be definitively connected to the crime. Sharon Pryor's murder became a cold case file, and her killer remained unknown. What troubles me most profoundly is understanding that in the years immediately following Sharon's murder, her killer may have been within the scope of police investigation. He may have been interviewed. He may have been a suspect. But without the means to definitively connect him to the crime through DNA evidence, he was eventually excluded from the investigation or simply lost as investigators pursued other leads. He lived his life. He had a career. He may have had relationships and a family. He lived in the Toronto area for decades after murdering my 14-year-old sister, and nobody knew that he was a killer. Nobody connected him to Sharon's death. He died in 2011, seemingly having evaded justice forever. For decades, my family carried the open wound of not knowing. We did not know who had murdered Sharon. We did not know if it was someone she knew or a stranger. We did not know if he was still alive or if he had died. We did not know if he had assaulted or murdered other people. We did not know if there were other victims. We simply carried the absence of answers, the permanent incompleteness of a case that could not be closed because the perpetrator could not be identified. In the early 2020s, the Toronto Police Service made the decision to submit evidence from historic cold cases to genetic genealogy laboratories. Sharon's case was included in this initiative. The biological evidence recovered from her murder, preserved for nearly 50 years, still contained enough DNA to create a usable genetic profile. That profile was uploaded to genetic genealogy databases, and the system began comparing it against millions of family trees and genetic profiles maintained by commercial ancestry services. The results identified a match. The match pointed to a family in the Toronto area, and investigators used traditional detective work to narrow down the specific family members who were the right age and location to have committed the murder in 1975. They eventually identified Norman Seeley as the perpetrator. Norman Seeley had been living in Toronto in 1975. He was the right age to have committed the crime. His genetic profile matched the biological evidence recovered from Sharon's murder with absolute certainty. But when police attempted to apprehend him, they discovered that Norman Seeley had died in 2011. He had lived an additional 36 years after murdering my 14-year-old sister. He had not been held accountable for his crime during his lifetime. He had not been convicted. He had not been imprisoned. He had simply lived out the remainder of his existence while my family carried the trauma of not knowing who had taken Sharon from us. The news of his identification came to our family in 2024, almost 50 years after Sharon's death. I was 71 years old. My parents were long deceased, having lived their entire remaining lives without ever knowing who murdered their daughter. Sharon had been dead for 48 years. The man who murdered her had been dead for 13 years. And yet finally, inexplicably, the mystery had been solved. I cannot describe adequately what it felt like to learn that genetic genealogy had finally revealed the identity of Sharon's killer. Part of me felt a sense of resolution, a confirmation that the mystery that had haunted my family for nearly half a century had finally been answered. But another part of me felt a profound sense of injustice, an understanding that the man who murdered my sister had lived out his entire life without ever being held accountable for his crime, without ever facing a trial, without ever being imprisoned, without ever experiencing the consequences that should have resulted from his brutal act. What genetic genealogy revealed was that Norman Seeley died in 2011 in the Toronto area. He was 75 years old at the time of his death. He had lived for 36 additional years after murdering a 14-year-old girl. He had lived through decades during which Sharon would never live. He had aged. He had had experiences. He had had relationships. He had had opportunities that were forever denied to my sister because he had stolen her life when she was only 14 years old. The case of Sharon Pryor is one of approximately 3,000 cold cases in Canada. It is one among countless murders where the perpetrator was never identified, never convicted, never held accountable for their crime. Some of those perpetrators are still alive, still living in communities, potentially still posing risks to others. Some of those perpetrators are already dead, having successfully escaped the justice system by dying before they could be identified. But what genetic genealogy has revealed is that even when perpetrators die before they can be arrested, even when they escape prosecution, the identification of their crimes can still bring some measure of resolution to families, can still provide answers to questions that have plagued survivors for decades. For my family, learning Norman Seeley's name almost 50 years after he murdered Sharon has brought a strange form of closure. We now know who killed her. We now understand that her murder was not committed by some unknown assailant, but by a specific person who lived in our community, who was known to authorities, who should have been caught in 1975 but was allowed to remain free through a combination of investigative limitations and bad luck. But this knowledge cannot bring Sharon back. It cannot give her the life that was stolen. It cannot undo the trauma that her murder inflicted on my family. It can only confirm what we already knew in our hearts, that a brutal, meaningless act of violence had permanently altered the trajectory of our lives. What gives me hope is understanding that genetic genealogy is now identifying perpetrators of cold cases at an accelerating rate. Other families like mine are finally receiving the answers that they have waited decades to obtain. But what troubles me is understanding that for every perpetrator we finally identify, there may be others whose crimes will never be solved, whose victims will never receive justice, whose families will never have the closure of knowing who killed their loved ones. The revolution of genetic genealogy is profound and transformative, but it also reveals the limitations of our justice system, the ways in which institutional failures allow perpetrators to escape accountability, and the permanent wounds that unsolved crimes inflict on families across generations. Sharon Pryor was murdered in 1975. Norman Seeley was finally identified as her killer in 2024. Justice has been served in the sense that her killer's identity is now known. But true justice would have required Norman Seeley to face trial, to be convicted, to spend the remainder of his life imprisoned as punishment for murdering my 14-year-old sister. That justice was denied by the limitations of the investigative tools available in 1975, and by the fact that Norman Seeley died before the technology that could identify him was developed and deployed. That is a form of injustice that genetic genealogy can expose but cannot ultimately remedy. My name is Detective Inspector Helen McKenzie, and I have spent 32 years working in homicide investigations in British Columbia, a career dedicated to solving murders, bringing perpetrators to justice, and providing closure to families devastated by loss. But there is one case that continues to haunt me, one investigation that represents not just the failure to solve a crime, but the systemic failures of law enforcement institutions to prioritize the protection and investigation of certain victims over others. On August 10, 2008, a young woman's body was discovered in the backyard of a mansion in the Vancouver area. She had been found nearly 2 years after her initial disappearance, her remains heavily decomposed, her identity eventually confirmed through dental records. Her name was Daisy. She was in her 30s at the time of her death, A woman with a life, with people who loved her, with a family that had been searching for her for almost 2 years before her remains were discovered by a property owner cleaning his yard. What troubles me most profoundly is not just that we failed to solve her murder, though that failure is absolute and damning. What troubles me most is understanding that our failure began long before we ever found her body. It began with the moment she first reported herself missing and law enforcement's catastrophic underestimation of the danger she faced. Daisy disappeared on September 15, 2006. She was living in the Vancouver area, working, maintaining relationships, engaged in the ordinary activities of a person building a life. On that September day, she indicated to people in her life that she was meeting someone, that she was going somewhere, and then she simply ceased to exist in any documented capacity. No one heard from her. She did not show up for work. She did not contact her family. She did not use her bank accounts or cell phone. She vanished. Within days, her family reported her missing to the Vancouver Police Department. They provided descriptions. They expressed concern about her welfare. They asked for help in locating her. The response from the VPD was inadequate. This is not my opinion as an investigator. This is the official finding of an inquiry that was later conducted into the handling of Daisy's case. The police response was documented as insufficient, as failing to treat the disappearance with appropriate urgency, as underestimating the possibility that Daisy was in danger. There were several contributing factors to this inadequate response, factors that revealed systemic problems within law enforcement's approach to missing persons investigations. First, Daisy was not a child. Children who disappear generate immediate concern and aggressive investigation. Daisy was an adult, and adult disappearances are sometimes categorized as voluntary absences, unless immediate evidence of foul play is apparent. Second, Daisy came from a vulnerable population, a group that has historically received less investigative resources and attention than other missing persons. Law enforcement agencies have been documented as showing bias in their allocation of resources, prioritizing investigations of missing middle-class white women, while treating disappearances of other populations with less urgency. But what infuriated me most when I reviewed the case file years later was understanding that during the first months after Daisy's disappearance, there were search warrants that should have been pursued, properties that should have been investigated, leads that should have been followed. Instead, the investigation languished. Detectives were assigned other cases. Resources were diverted. Daisy's disappearance remained in a holding pattern, neither actively investigated nor officially closed. Her family continued to reach out to police to ask for updates, to beg for resources to be devoted to finding their missing loved one. But the response remained inadequate, remained insufficient, remained demonstrably inadequate according to the standards and procedures that should have been applied to all missing persons cases, regardless of the victim's demographic background. Nearly 2 years passed. 2 years during which Daisy's remains lay decomposing in a backyard in the Vancouver area, approximately 15 kilometers from where she had last been seen. 2 years during which her family suffered the torture of not knowing, of hoping that she might still be alive, of making media appeals, of distributing flyers, of engaging in the desperate search that the police should have been conducting with full resources from the moment her disappearance was reported. Then, on August 10, 2008, a property owner decided to clean up his yard. He had owned the mansion for approximately 2 years, but had not extensively developed the property. The backyard contained overgrown vegetation, areas that had not been carefully maintained. When the property owner dug in the yard to begin work on landscaping, his workers discovered human remains. Emergency services were called, police arrived, forensic examinations were conducted. Dental records were used to confirm the identity. The remains belonged to Daisy, missing since September 15, 2006. What followed was an investigation that was more thorough than the initial missing persons case, but that was also hampered by the fact that nearly 2 years had passed since Daisy's disappearance. Evidence had degraded. Witness memories had faded. The contamination of the body by 2 years of decomposition and environmental exposure meant that certain forensic analyses were compromised. The immediate circumstances of her death could not be definitively established. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, suggesting that she had been murdered. But the specific manner of her death could not be precisely determined. More importantly, the delay in discovering her body meant that any potential perpetrator had nearly 2 years to establish an alibi, to dispose of evidence, to craft a narrative that could not easily be contradicted. If Daisy's disappearance had been treated with appropriate urgency from the beginning, if property searches had been conducted immediately rather than after 2 years, if the investigation had been properly resourced from the first moment she went missing, there is a reasonable probability that evidence would have been preserved, that the perpetrator could have been identified and apprehended in a time frame when their guilt was not obscured by degradation in time. What the subsequent inquiry found was that the Vancouver Police Department had failed in multiple specific ways. First, they had failed to treat Daisy's disappearance with appropriate urgency, given that she was from a vulnerable population. Second, they had failed to pursue search warrants for properties that should have been investigated. Third, they had failed to allocate adequate resources to the missing persons investigation. Fourth, they had failed to coordinate effectively with other law enforcement agencies that might have had information relevant to the case. The inquiry concluded that these failures constituted a systemic problem within the VPD's approach to missing persons investigations, a problem that likely affected not just Daisy, but other missing persons whose cases received inadequate investigative resources. The most infuriating aspect of the inquiry's findings was understanding that responsibility for these systemic failures was ultimately diffused. No individual officer was held accountable. No police administrator faced discipline. The failures were attributed to resource constraints and systemic problems, rather than to specific decisions made by identifiable individuals. The VPD acknowledged the failures, apologized to Daisy's family, and stated that procedures had been revised to ensure that future missing persons cases would receive appropriate investigative resources. But that acknowledgement came too late for Daisy. It came after her remains had been in the ground for 2 years, after the critical window for evidence preservation had passed, after her killer had had nearly 2 years to establish an alibi or flee. To this day, Daisy's murder remains officially unsolved. No one has been charged with her death. No one has been convicted. No one has been held accountable for what was done to her. What we know is that she disappeared on September 15th, 2006. What we know is that her remains were found on August 10th, 2008, in a backyard approximately 15 kilometers from where she had last been seen. What we know is that she was murdered. What we do not know is who murdered her, or why, or what could have changed if the initial investigation had been conducted with appropriate urgency and resources. When I think about Daisy, I think about the lost opportunity that her case represents. I think about the investigation that should have been conducted in September and October of 2006, when evidence was fresh, when witnesses' memories were clear, when the perpetrator might have made mistakes that could be documented and used to establish guilt. I think about the families who have had to wait years, sometimes decades, for resolution of their missing loved ones' cases because law enforcement agencies prioritized other cases, other victims, other investigations over theirs. I think about the systemic bias that leads to certain disappearances receiving immediate and aggressive investigation, while other disappearances languish in files and waiting lists. The case of Daisy stands as a reminder of how institutional failures can extend the suffering of families, how bias in resource allocation can have devastating consequences, and how the absence of justice can be as traumatic as the crime itself. Her family will never know who murdered their loved one. They will never have the opportunity to face that perpetrator in court. They will never have the closure that comes from a conviction and sentence. What they have instead is the knowledge that their family member was murdered, that the investigation into her death was inadequate, that the system designed to protect and seek justice for victims failed catastrophically in Daisy's case. The Vancouver Police Department has since implemented procedural changes in response to the inquiry into Daisy's case. Missing persons investigations now receive more immediate resources. Vulnerable populations are now treated with more appropriate urgency. Property searches are now conducted more promptly when there is reason to believe that a missing person might be located at a particular location. These changes are necessary and welcome, but they represent a response to failure, an acknowledgement that the system had not been working as it should have been, and they came far too late for Daisy and too late for her family to experience any sense of resolution in their search for answers. What I know after 32 years in this profession is that justice delayed is justice denied, but that the alternative, justice never obtained, is infinitely worse. For Daisy's family, that is the reality they have had to live with. For the Vancouver Police Department, it is a reminder that every missing persons case, regardless of the victim's demographic background, deserves to be treated with urgency, with appropriate resources, and with the full commitment of law enforcement to find answers and bring perpetrators to justice. Those lessons were expensive, purchased with the life of a young woman whose remains lay undiscovered for nearly 2 years, while the investigation that should have been actively pursued remained inadequately resourced and insufficiently urgent. Her death and the failures that surrounded it stand as testimony to the imperative that all victims deserve equal protection, equal investigation, equal access to justice, regardless of their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or any other demographic characteristic that should never be permitted to influence the allocation of law enforcement resources or the dedication of investigators to solving their cases. My name is Robert Ashford, and I am a private investigator who has spent the last 18 years of my career attempting to solve one of Canada's most infamous disappearances. On May 24, 2007, a prominent and enigmatic figure named Thomas Magnuson simply vanished from Toronto, leaving behind only questions, conspiracy theories, and the persistent mystery of what happened to a man who was simultaneously beloved by some and viewed with suspicion by others. Thomas was a theater magnate, a man who had built a successful entertainment empire across multiple cities in Ontario, a person whose public persona was theatrical and flamboyant, but whose private life remained largely shrouded in mystery. He was 56 years old at the time of his disappearance. He has never been found. His case remains one of Canada's most famous missing persons investigations, and to this day, nobody knows with certainty what happened to him or whether he is alive or dead. Thomas Magnuson was born in Vancouver but made his reputation in Toronto as a theater impresario, a man who understood the business of entertainment, who could market productions, who had a gift for understanding what audiences wanted. He had founded several successful theater companies. He had produced plays and productions that had achieved critical acclaim. He was known in Toronto's entertainment community as a visionary, a man with connections to powerful people in the arts, a figure who attended gallery openings and theater galas, and was frequently photographed at social events. But he was also known as someone with whom business relationships sometimes became complicated, as someone whose financial arrangements were sometimes opaque, as someone whose personal life seemed to exist in a carefully constructed realm of secrecy and compartmentalization. On May 24, 2007, Thomas Magnuson attended a business meeting in downtown Toronto. The meeting was routine, reportedly involving discussions about a new production. After the meeting ended, Thomas indicated that he was returning to his condo in the Bloor and Bathurst area. He was seen leaving the meeting location around 3 p.m. He drove his black Mercedes, a car that was distinctive and recognizable, and then he simply ceased to exist in any documented capacity. He did not return to his condo. He did not contact his business associates. He did not show up for scheduled appointments. He disappeared completely and utterly, leaving behind only the mystery of what had happened to him. Within days, his family reported him missing to the Toronto Police Service. The investigation that followed was massive, generating unprecedented media attention in Canada. Thomas was not just an ordinary missing person. He was a known figure in Toronto's cultural scene, a man whose disappearance generated speculation and theories from the moment it became public knowledge. The police investigation involved hundreds of interviews, thousands of investigative hours, and the deployment of resources on a scale that reflected both the prominence of the missing person and the public fascination with the case. What emerged from the investigation were several competing theories about what had happened to Thomas. The most widely accepted theory was that Thomas had met with someone he believed he could trust, possibly someone with whom he had a business relationship, and that something had gone terribly wrong during their interaction. Some investigators believed that Thomas had been murdered, that his body had been disposed of in a location that had not yet been discovered. Others theorized that Thomas had staged his own disappearance, that he had chosen to abandon his life in Toronto and begin anew somewhere else, using resources that he had carefully accumulated to facilitate his escape. Still others proposed theories involving organized crime, suggesting that Thomas had become entangled in situations with dangerous people and had either been killed as a result or had disappeared to escape their threats. The investigation pursued multiple suspects. Several people in Thomas's business circle were interviewed extensively. Some of them became the focus of intense media speculation, but without concrete evidence of foul play, without a body, without definitive proof that a crime had been committed. The police investigation eventually exhausted its leads. Suspects were questioned and released. Theories were developed and discarded. The investigation gradually transitioned from an active case to a cold case, from a matter of immediate attention to one that was occasionally revisited, but for which no clear resolution seemed possible. What particularly frustrated investigators was understanding that Thomas's disappearance occurred in a pre-digital era in terms of surveillance. Security cameras existed, but they were not ubiquitous as they are today. Cell phone tracking was possible, but required specific warrants and cooperation from service providers. DNA technology had existed for decades, but required a suspect to test against. Without a body to examine, without a crime scene to investigate, without physical evidence connecting any specific person to foul play, the investigation was constrained by the limitations of forensic science and investigative technique. Over the years, various theories were proposed and investigated. One theory suggested that Thomas had been kidnapped and was being held captive somewhere. Another theory proposed that Thomas had been murdered and that his body had been transported out of the city. Yet another theory suggested that Thomas had died of natural causes in a location where his remains had not been discovered. But perhaps the most enduring theory, the one that has persisted in media coverage and public speculation, is that Thomas somehow staged his own disappearance, that he had orchestrated his own vanishing, and that he is alive somewhere, living under an assumed identity, having successfully escaped the life that he had constructed in Toronto. This theory is supported by certain circumstantial facts. Thomas's financial records were complex, suggesting that he had significant resources that might not have been immediately apparent to authorities. He had travel experience and connections in multiple countries. His business affairs had been complicated and occasionally controversial, suggesting that there might have been motivation for him to disappear. He had no immediate family obligations that would have made remaining in Canada essential. And perhaps most significantly, despite decades of searching, despite the involvement of private investigators, despite countless leads that were pursued and discarded, no body has ever been found. But this theory is also constrained by the reality that over 18 years have passed since Thomas's disappearance. If he staged his own disappearance and is alive somewhere, maintaining that deception for nearly 2 decades would require extraordinary discipline, financial resources, and a complete severing of all connections to his previous life. It would require that no one who knew him had encountered him in 18 years. It would require that he had not attempted to contact anyone he knew, that he had not accessed any of his assets in ways that would have triggered investigation, that he had completely erased himself from all systems of documentation and communication. While theoretically possible, such an achievement would be remarkably difficult to maintain over nearly 2 decades. The alternative theory, that Thomas was murdered and that his body has never been discovered, is also challenging to reconcile with the evidence. If Thomas was murdered in Toronto, the disposal of a body should have generated discoverable evidence at some point over 18 years. A body exposed to the elements deteriorates in ways that are eventually discoverable. A body concealed in a structure or location should eventually be found through renovation, construction, or systematic searching. Yet despite decades of investigation, despite the deployment of resources, no body has been discovered. What I have learned from 18 years of investigating this case is that some mysteries may resist resolution indefinitely. The disappearance of Thomas Magnuson has generated thousands of hours of investigation, hundreds of theories, extensive media coverage, and the passionate engagement of people who believe they know what happened to him. But none of these efforts has yielded a definitive answer. The case remains in a state of permanent suspension, neither closed nor solved, neither definitively explained nor successfully investigated to a point of resolution. Various psychics and clairvoyants have offered theories about Thomas's fate, claiming to have received intuitive or spiritual insights into what happened to him. Cryptographers have attempted to decode messages that might have been left behind by Thomas, believing that he might have left cryptic clues about his location or fate. Amateur detectives have pursued their own investigations, following leads that they believe have been overlooked by official authorities. But none of these efforts, despite their creativity and dedication, have solved the mystery. What continues to haunt the investigation is understanding that Thomas disappeared in an era that is not quite modern and not quite pre-digital. Surveillance was limited but not non-existent. Digital records were being created but not with the ubiquity that exists today. Financial transactions could be traced but not with the completeness that current technology allows. In some ways, the year 2007 was the worst possible time for someone to disappear. Recent enough that digital records should exist, but early enough that surveillance was sufficiently limited that complete documentation of movements was not always possible. The case of Thomas Magnuson stands as a reminder that, despite all of our advances in forensic science, despite all of our technologies for surveillance and tracking, despite the comprehensive systems we have built for documentation and investigation, some mysteries remain unsolved. Some people simply disappear, and we never learn with certainty what happened to them. Whether Thomas is alive or dead, whether he disappeared voluntarily or was taken against his will, whether his disappearance was a crime or a choice, we may never know with absolute certainty. And that uncertainty, that permanent ambiguity, is perhaps the most maddening aspect of the entire case. My name is Detective James Hewitt, and I have spent 17 years investigating the brutal murder of Lindsay Buziak, a real estate agent who was murdered in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on January 24, 2007. Her case represents one of Canada's most perplexing cold cases, a murder that remains unsolved and active, investigated with intense dedication by law enforcement, family members, and amateur investigators around the world, yet still yielding no arrests, no convictions, and no satisfactory explanation for who murdered this young woman and why. Lindsay was 24 years old when she was killed. She was working as a real estate agent showing a vacant house in an upscale neighborhood of Saskatoon to what she believed were potential buyers. She was murdered in that vacant house, killed in a manner that suggested calculation, planning, and deliberate violence. Almost 2 decades later, we still do not know who committed this murder or what motivated the perpetrators to target this specific young woman on this specific day. This is the story of how a murder can occur in broad daylight in a neighborhood full of homes, and how the perpetrator can remain unknown and unpunished for 17 years, despite intensive investigation and public engagement in the case. Lindsay Buziak was born and raised in Saskatoon, a city in central Saskatchewan with a population of approximately 300,000 people. She was the youngest of 3 children in her family, described by those who knew her as bright, ambitious, and driven. She had pursued a career in real estate, a profession that seemed to offer opportunity and financial reward. By the time she was 24, she had already achieved a degree of success in her field, building a reputation as a dedicated and professional agent. She was engaged to be married. She had dreams for her future. She believed that her life was on an upward trajectory, that her career and personal relationships were developing in positive directions, that she had many years ahead of her in which to build the life she wanted. On January 23, 2007, Lindsay received a phone call about a potential real estate showing. Someone calling themselves a potential buyer indicated that they were interested in viewing a recently listed property at 1151 Edgemont Boulevard, a large vacant house in an upscale neighborhood of Saskatoon. The potential buyer wanted to schedule a showing for January 24th. Lindsay agreed to show the property. This decision, made in a moment that seemed routine, professional, and ordinary, would be the last decision of her life. On January 24th, at approximately 2:00 p.m., Lindsay drove to the property and let herself into the vacant house using the realtor's lockbox. She had shown dozens of properties. She had met with hundreds of potential buyers. She had no reason to believe that this showing would be different from the routine showings that comprised the bulk of her professional life. What happened next occurred in a vacant house in a residential neighborhood, visible to neighbors, but sufficiently private that what occurred inside went unwitnessed and uninterrupted. At approximately 2:30 p.m., less than 30 minutes after Lindsay had let herself into the house, someone was leaving the property. Lindsay's fiancé, who was supposed to meet her at the property, arrived to find paramedics and police already present. Lindsay had been found inside the house, critically injured. Despite emergency medical intervention, she died from her injuries before arriving at the hospital. The autopsy revealed that Lindsay had been stabbed multiple times. The wounds were severe and deliberate, consistent with a calculated attack rather than a crime of passion. The injury suggested that Lindsay had been attacked without warning, without opportunity to defend herself effectively, without the ability to escape or summon help. She had fought for her life. Evidence suggested that there had been a struggle, but her attacker or attackers had overwhelmed her, had subdued her, and had inflicted fatal injuries. What disturbed investigators most profoundly was the apparent planning that had gone into the murder. The phone call requesting the showing appeared to have been premeditated. The choice of location, a vacant house, suggested that the perpetrator or perpetrators had selected a location where violence could occur without immediate detection. The timing of the attack, occurring within a narrow window during which Lindsay was alone in the property, suggested that the perpetrator had knowledge of when she would be present and how long she might remain there. This was not a random crime. This was not a crime of opportunity by a stranger. This appeared to be a targeted attack, a calculated murder of a specific person by someone or multiple someones who had planned the crime in advance. The investigation that followed was intensive. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing neighbors about whether they had seen anyone entering or leaving the property, whether they had heard anything unusual, whether they could identify potential suspects. Forensic evidence was collected from the crime scene. Lindsay's phone records were examined to trace the person who had called her to request the showing. Security cameras in the neighborhood were reviewed, but these initial investigative efforts did not immediately yield the identity of the perpetrator or perpetrators. What emerged as investigators pursued multiple leads was a complicated picture, suggesting that the murder might have been commissioned, that someone may have hired the perpetrator or perpetrators to murder Lindsay for reasons that remained unclear. This theory was supported by the apparent premeditation of the crime, by the calculation involved in the planning, and by the apparent professional nature of the execution. But identifying who may have commissioned the murder or who may have carried it out proved remarkably difficult. The phone call that had led Lindsay to the vacant house was traced back to an untraceable number, making it impossible to identify the person who had made the call. The perpetrator or perpetrators who had entered the house either left no forensic evidence that could be matched to an existing database or left evidence that did not match any known offenders in law enforcement systems. The crime scene itself, while thoroughly documented and investigated, did not yield definitive evidence that could point to a specific suspect. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed about Lindsay's murder. Some investigators have suggested that she was killed as a result of a dispute with someone she knew personally. Others have proposed that the murder was related to her real estate career, that it was connected to property disputes or business disagreements. Still, others have theorized that Lindsay was killed as a result of a crime of passion, that she had been involved with someone who became obsessed with her or who felt rejected by her. And some have suggested that she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, that she was the victim of a random attack by someone who targeted her without knowing her personally or having specific motivation beyond committing violence. The most persistent and widely discussed theory in recent years involves the possibility that someone close to Lindsay, someone she knew personally, commissioned her murder. This theory is supported by the apparent planning of the crime and by the knowledge of her schedule that would have been necessary to coordinate the fake showing call with the presence of a perpetrator at the property. But despite investigative efforts, despite offers of reward money, despite appeals to the public for information, no arrest has been made. The identity of the perpetrator or perpetrators remains unknown. What I find most disturbing about this case is the understanding that a murder can occur so meticulously, so deliberately, so openly, in a residential neighborhood in the middle of the day, and yet the perpetrator can remain unknown for 17 years. The police investigation has been thorough and persistent. Detectives have worked the case continuously. Forensic technology has advanced significantly since 2007, and evidence has been re-examined with modern techniques. But despite all of these efforts, the case remains unsolved. In 2021, the Saskatoon Police Service announced that advancements in DNA technology had opened new leads in the investigation. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the technology that had solved so many other cold cases might finally provide the breakthrough needed to identify Lindsay's killer. But those new leads, whatever they were, have not yet resulted in arrests or charges. The case remains actively investigated but fundamentally unresolved. What troubles me most as an investigator is understanding that somewhere in Saskatchewan, possibly still in the Saskatoon area, the person or people responsible for Lindsay Buziak's murder may be living their lives free from accountability, unpunished for what they did. They may be going about their business, working, maintaining relationships, participating in their community, with no external indication that they have committed this brutal crime, or they may have fled. They may be living in another province or another country, having successfully distanced themselves from the crime they committed. Lindsay's murder remains one of Canada's most prominent cold cases, kept alive by her family's persistent efforts to maintain public awareness of the case, by annual memorials, by media coverage on anniversaries of her death, by private investigators who continue to pursue leads. Her case has been featured on television programs about unsolved murders. Her story has been discussed on podcasts and in forums dedicated to true crime investigation. Her face appears on websites about Canada's unsolved mysteries. But despite all of this attention, despite the public engagement with her case, despite the investigative resources deployed, her killer remains unknown. What Lindsay's murder reveals is the dark reality that some crimes, despite occurring in relatively public spaces, despite being committed in residential neighborhoods, despite being investigated with significant resources, can remain unsolved for nearly 2 decades. It reveals the limitations of our investigative systems, the ways in which premeditated violence can be executed and hidden, the manner in which perpetrators can escape accountability through careful planning, and the absence of definitive forensic evidence. It reveals that justice, even for victims whose cases receive significant attention and resources, is not guaranteed. Some murders remain cold cases indefinitely, and the families and loved ones of victims are left to carry the burden of unsolved tragedy, the absence of answers, and the persistent not knowing about what happened and who was responsible